Hello, everyone. My name is Sue Kim. I'm the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Studies in the College of Fine Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. I'm also a board member of the Greeley Scholar Program. I want to welcome you to the third event in the Greeley Peace Scholar Speaker Series on Race and Social Justice. We're very excited today to have Dr. Stephanie Sparling Williams here today from the Holyoke College Art Museum. I just wanted to say that this event is co-sponsored by the Greeley Peace Scholar Program, the College of Fine Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and the Race and Ethnic Studies Program and the Art History Program. So I just also wanted to mention that a week from today, the next two events in the Greeley series will be on October 22nd. We have two on the same day. At 11 a.m. on October 22nd, Dr. Frederick Harris will give a talk titled Voter Suppression Then and Now, How Did We Get Here and What Can Be Done? And I will share the link, the website for registration in the chat. Later that day on October 22nd at 1 p.m., Jarrett Ahmed Shiel, who is a music educator and performer, will give a talk titled The Socio-Historical Foundations of Hip-Hop Pedagogies, the Why, When, Where, Who, and How. And that one is hosted by the music department. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Kirsten Swenson, who is Associate Professor of Art and Art History. And I will turn it over to Kirsten.
Thank you, Sue. It's my pleasure to introduce today's main event. Our speaker, Stephanie Sparling Williams. Dr. Williams's scholarly and curatorial work represent important interdisciplinary directions in the field of art history, drawing from American studies, performance studies, and a close engagement with museum institutions. Dr. Williams is currently Associate Curator at the Mount Holyoke College Art Museum, as well as visiting lecturer in art history and Africana studies at Mount Holyoke, and adjunct professor in art history at Eastern Connecticut State University. Prior to her position at Mount Holyoke, she was assistant curator at the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover. Some of us at UMass Lowell, some of our classes had the opportunity to experience Dr. Williams's dynamic gallery talks at the Addison. A highlight was visiting her exhibition Harlem in Situ in 2019, which focused on Black visual culture from the Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance to the present. It was an exciting, ambitious show that cast the Addison's collection in a new light. Harlem in Situ brought together artists like Jacob Lawrence and Kehinde Wiley, who had perhaps not before shared the same walls, and it conveyed a passionate political sense of place. Before arriving at the Addison, Dr. Williams was the John Walsh Fellow at the Yale University Art Gallery. She earned an MA and Ph.D. in American Studies and Ethnicity, and a certificate in Visual Studies from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Dr. Williams's talk today is based on her forthcoming book, Speaking Out of Turn, Lorraine O'Grady and the Art of Language, which will be published by the University of California Press in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Williams. And just a quick note before Dr. Williams takes over to say that if you have questions throughout her talk, please enter them into the chat, and we should have plenty of time after her talk concludes to go through the Q&A. So thank you. And Dr. Williams, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for the warm welcome and the generous introduction. I want to echo the gratitude expressed for each of the supporting campus partners, with a special thanks to Dr. Kirsten Swenson and her contemporary art class tuning in today from the virtual realm of UMass Lowell. Thank you for the invitation and for engaging the work of contemporary Black performance artists in your studies. And to Dr. Sue Kim in the Dean's Office and English Department, and Dr. Betsy Herbin-Traint in the History Department. Hey, Betsy. Thank you all so much for your warm invitation. I want to also thank those of you who are listening across New England and beyond. I'm so thankful for your time and attention this afternoon, especially in these complex and terrifying times. In this moment, I have been making many returns to the work of artists, especially as their work pertains to issues of equity and social justice. My personal and professional work, I view the work of artists as both a kind of mirror and social compass, ones that help us see ourselves more clearly while also pointing us to better, more just, more creative, more equitable, more humane, and more empowered futures. So all this to say, I am deeply appreciative of the stewards of the interdisciplinary departmental resources that were mobilized to support today's talk, and the Greeley Peace Program for selecting an arts-related talk to be a part of the Greeley Peace Scholar Speaker Series on race and social justice. So today, as the title for my talk suggests, I will be focusing on the work of one artist in particular, Lorraine O'Grady. And as Kirsten mentioned, Dr. Swenson, excuse me, mentioned, I will be drawing heavily on a chapter from my forthcoming book, Speaking Out of Turn, Lorraine O'Grady and the Art of Language. For our time together, I thought I'd focus a bit on introductions for those of you who are unfamiliar with her work, but also provide a sneak preview of the book itself, my conception of speaking out of turn, and how I understand O'Grady's performance practice in the early 1980s as building on past histories of calls for radical change and inclusion, and also paving the way for some of our contemporary struggles for greater access and equitable representation in the art world. Quickly, before I introduce to you Lorraine O'Grady, I want to frame my thoughts by way of an acknowledgement of some, get this, quality content alert. This content has been inspiring my work in this moment of global pandemic and the uprisings against racism and police violence. Towards the beginning of the pandemic in April, a dear friend of mine shared this series produced by the Pacific School of Religion entitled Living Democracy, Art and Culture, and hosted by Jeff Chang. It's really good. I think everyone should check it out if you're interested in the intersections of art and culture. Incredible interdisciplinary artists, scholars, short webinar style exchanges, demonstrations, and I think they're just really rich and inspiring. In one of the opening segments, Chang notes that we are living in a time of prophets and artists, and I really couldn't agree more. He goes on to describe some of these prophets as lone voices out in the wilderness, screaming to be heard, and artists as those strange and often estranged observers at the edge of society peering in, both offering us new stories, new visions, new hope, new futures. And said another way, and perhaps more simply, artists see the world differently. They always have, and I pray that they always will, which is why I do the work that I do on artists like Lorraine O'Grady. I'm invested in seeing the world differently. And so I hope the next 30, 40 minutes or so, Lorraine O'Grady's work, as it has me over the years, helps maybe see the world a little bit differently, the art world in particular. So let me introduce you to one such prophet and artist, Lorraine O'Grady. So Lorraine O'Grady is a feminist conceptual artist who began her professional arts career in New York during the late 1970s. Like so many women and artists of African descent working at that time, O'Grady's art and practice was largely overlooked. Now, the artist is in her late 80s and she is more productive than ever and has enjoyed greater visibility as her work is being widely exhibited and enthusiastically engaged in both art media and scholarship. Today, O'Grady's impressive interdisciplinary and tremendously significant body of collages, performances, and photo-based installations is exhibited internationally and nationally. And her writing is also receiving considerable attention, particularly her much anthologized essay, Olympia's Maid, Reclaiming Black Female Subjectivity. And also there's a collection of the artist's writing out titled Lorraine O'Grady, Writing in Space, 1973 to 2019. And it's either out currently or just about to be released from Duke University Press. So I just want to encourage folks who find her work interesting, to definitely check out those resources if you're interested in learning more from the artist directly. And while this new attention to O'Grady's body of work has generated numerous critical insights, much of her archive and the arc of her performance practice still remains unexamined. In addition to tracing the artist's career evolution, Speaking Out of Turn, the book, reveals the extent to which O'Grady's entire creative practice is predicated on her critical engagement with language, and more specifically, how the written and spoken word have shaped her impressive career. And this is where I believe her practice to be its most prophetic. So I want to take us now back to 1980s, a time when O'Grady began to demand, not like others before her, that we start to see the art world differently. So I want to just note that those of you who are O'Grady scholars or know of her work, the images that I'm about to show you are not the same, not representative of the story or the account I'm going to tell of her first performance. Many of you know that the images on the screen are from a different iteration of the performance that happened at the new museum, but I am going to be describing, for those who have not are unfamiliar with the performance, her first performance at the Just Above Midtown Gallery. So just note that these are two separate performances, but only one set of documentation. So on the evening of June 5th, 1980, the 25th anniversary of a fictitious international beauty pageant, artist Lorraine O'Grady executed her carefully choreographed appearance as the pageant's winner, Miss Black Bourgeoise of Boston, Massachusetts. This persona appeared at the opening reception of the Black Avant-Garde art space just above Midtown, which had recently inaugurated its new space in Tribeca, New York. The prize was the title, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, 1955, which translates to Miss Black Middle Class, 1955. And the prize included, with the title, an intricately beaded crown of looping design, complete with 2 congruent rows of white rhinestones atop a band of shiny pearls. The cast of O'Grady's initial performance consisted of 2 roles: the poised debutante, played by O'Grady herself, and the master of ceremonies, played by Dr. Edward B. Allen, a dentist from Stamford, Connecticut, and O'Grady's brother-in-law, who was outfitted significantly in a borrowed tuxedo jacket. There were other parts of the play, there were other parts to play as well. They were listed in O'Grady's performance script as photographers, video cameramen, disco band, and guests of the opening. The audience, unbeknownst to them, were to play the part of the court and subjects in attendance of Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's Silver Jubilee. Promptly at 9 o'clock in the evening, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire and her masters of ceremonies arrived for her celebration to the JAM gallery opening for the exhibition Outlaw Aesthetics. As noted in the script, the emergence of the beauty contestant and her company was met with oohs and ahs from all sides for Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's elaborate gown, which was an extravagant debutante-style gown made of 180 pairs of white gloves. And here is an installation view of the work, so you can kind of get a sense of the design and the gloves and the crown. After entering the lively space, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire mingled with the opening attendees, a crowd she later identifies as her subjects, handing out white chrysanthemums from her strangely fashioned bouquet. And once all the flowers were distributed from the bouquet, the beauty queen revealed a knotted cat of 9 tails and began beating herself with the whip that made plantations move. She then bellowed her poem, "That's enough. No more bootlicking, no more ass kissing, no more buttering up, no more posturing of super assimilates. Black art must take more risks." And then she exited in haste. That summer, and over the course of the next 3 years, O'Grady would go on to stage a series of these guerrilla invasions on New York art spaces as the now notorious Miss Black Middle Class. Her first appearance at the Just Above Midtown Gallery was the artist's very first public performance ever, and the beginning of what would become numerous simultaneous critiques on the too safe creative output of Black artists in New York, and the lack of critical attention given to diverse Black creatives in the New York art world. Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's persona had come to O'Grady as she walked through Union Square in Manhattan a month after the opening of Afro-American Abstraction at the Institute of Art and Urban Resources, known as PS1, now MoMA PS1. O'Grady had been disappointed with the exhibition, but unable to identify why, when a vision came over her and she felt herself covered in white gloves. Standing in the park, she thought to herself, quote, "This is what was wrong with that show. It was art with white gloves on," end quote. Too safe and pandering to the institution's predominantly white audiences. So briefly for a moment, I want to return to this idea of living democracy, that democracy is something practiced, enacted, and performed, because I want to make the argument that these early performances of Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, and as we'll see in later projects and iterations such as the Black and White Show and Art Is, that O'Grady's particular experiments position artistic practices and gestures towards democracy as avant-garde, troubling the distinctions between public life and fine art, as well as tired and crusty tensions between high and low culture. So I just wanted to frame that for a moment. And here I also want to quickly draw attention to the shouted poem. So Audre Lorde reminds us that poetry is not only dream or vision, it's the skeleton architecture of our lives. And I love that verse, or I love that thought. And I have to say that it's no coincidence that O'Grady uses poetry in these performances. And while O'Grady was indeed pleasantly surprised later, we'll learn, by the responses to her lyrical provocation in Art Is, which we'll get to in a moment, Lorde points us to the ways that poetry's inherent value or inherent power is in its ability to serve as a blueprint for social possibility. And for O'Grady, as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, exploring non-European ways of being, or ways of being that do not cater to European sensibilities, and to explore new worldviews, tap into alternative sources of creativity, and as we see in a few minutes with performances such as Art Is. So I'm trying to kind of do both and think of this as creating social possibility and democracy as perhaps avant-garde art practice, or this new way to think about democracy alongside avant-garde art practice. So as my book and as this talk examines in a kind of more abridged form, the art of a Black American woman using her creative practice to trace the bounds of direct address as an artistic strategy, it must also acknowledge the long historical legacy of Black cultural politics within the United States, making the connection between O'Grady's contemporary performance art and historic uses of direct address strategies towards survival and self-determination. In the 1800s, for example, abolitionist practitioners such as Henry Box Brown, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass, as we well know, took up direct address strategies as both aesthetic enactments and to literally speak and exist out of turn as a critical means of liberation. As discussed, in greater depth in my book, in the introduction, it is also through the speech acts of folks like Maria Stewart, Josephine V, and Rachel Gentile, which is a historic example, and then two more contemporary examples of actors in the court of law. It's important to explore how multimodal performance artists like O'Grady inherit these fraught interventive histories of existing out of turn as a means for survival and creative being. Just as the aforementioned actors and their cultural enactments contextualize O'Grady's disruptive approach, the artist's direct address, concept-based work illuminates, through contemporary praxis, nuanced and under-theorized aspects of a particular creative and aesthetic past. Fundamental to how I locate and name O'Grady's process and the ways the artist has come to engage the issues of silence and erasure is this notion of speaking out of turn. So I did a lot of, trying to, for this very short moment, historicize or locate these actions as not new, right? Coming out of a history of African-American cultural producers, performers, abolitionists in some cases, using these tactics to to survive in some cases, but to enact creative existence. And I'm not the only scholar that's doing this. In fact, there are many: Daphne Brooks, Yuri McMillan, Christina Sharp, there are Monica Miller, just amazing work that's being done on this historical use of performance and historical enactments of the body. But I just wanted to kind of bracket that for this talk, that there is a deep legacy and history in this work and in the scholarship. So to move on to speaking out of turn, and to give you a little bit of a preview of how I'm understanding and framing Lorraine O'Grady's practice. So speaking out of turn is an idiom I've adopted and retooled in order to theorize the unique position and strategies of Black women and women-identified artists of color, O'Grady in particular, as they work through complex histories of exclusion and structures of power and visibility in art industries and art historical discourse. Through the text, and today through the lecture, speaking out of turn is implicated and historically situated as a critical methodology within O'Grady's art and within broader histories of speech acts and performances of visibility emerging from the African diaspora. By definition, the idiom to speak out of turn is predicated on a pre-existing turn or order of speech. To speak out of turn means you have done so when it is not your turn, or it means you've spoken when it is not your turn to do so. And as scholar and artist Michelle Wallace's early work recognizes, the revolutionary power of speaking out of turn, and she argues that it is one of the only traditions available to the Black female critical voice. Art critic and curator Lucy Lippard evokes this powerful stance in her essay about Wallace's work, and out of turn for Lippard can be understood as outside the dizzying circle of white and male discourse. I use this phrase in order to further develop and revitalize the vocabulary necessary for intervening in Western, white, male-centric discourses of art history and the study of visual objects, as well as for discussing the interventions that O'Grady's art is making. More broadly defined, speaking out of turn connotes speaking at the of this living democracy. O'Grady is really experimenting with democratic process and collectivity through these boisterous and invasive out-of-turn enactments through resistance. And we'll see that even more later on as we get to art is. In fact, historically we see this through the social, cultural, and political history of this country, that the only way, and along with Wallace, we're finding that the only way for Black women in particular to participate in American democracy, that their participation in the system, a system that is designed to exclude them, is inherently out of turn, right? Out of sync, unsolicited. Especially when we get to art, images of what democracy looks like, what the art world looks like. And so the visual structure of democracy, or of the art world, is the visual structure that O'Grady's presence is disrupting. And so speaking out of turn then is also a decolonial apparatus, a methodology of the historically silenced and oppressed that O'Grady uses in her practice to trouble the field of vision and claim a voice in the art world. Broadly, art that speaks out of turn is a necessary response to a long history of silencing and erasing Black artists and artists of color within Western history and culture. Using this analytic, I examine the strategies of address O'Grady adopts, and then drawing upon theories of performance, interpolation, and cultural and visual studies in the book, provide an interdisciplinary analysis and framework to assess works by O'Grady and her contemporaries that can be said to speak out of turn. So it was just a little preview. But so in analyzing the ways O'Grady mobilizes direct address strategies in the contemporary art world by speaking and existing out of turn, arguably the disruptive nature of unsolicited speech has an impact on these spaces, like art museums, altering exhibition dynamics and gallery spaces in interesting ways. Through a variety of creative media and performance technology, O'Grady's art reorients viewers to complex issues of class, race, gender into the conceptual underpinnings in each of her bodies of work. I think I'm missing a couple of my slides. I'm just gonna move through a few of these so you can see. My linguistic focus on O'Grady's art, however, moves beyond real or imagined speak-jacks to examine what the artist has done or does with the platform of the Contemporary Art Museum when she has inventively fashioned herself within the structure of visual existence. Said another way, my work is really dedicated to exploring the semiotics embedded in the work of O'Grady as she has stepped into the field of vision and claimed a voice. And naturally, I'm concerned with what this voice sounds like, but more prominently, I'm asking in this moment and for us to ask what this voice looks like. If speaking out of turn can be understood in perhaps the Sandovallian sense as a methodology of oppressed or marginalized individuals and communities, I argue that direct address is part of speaking out of turn's technological repertoire in the art of Lorraine O'Grady and others. Direct address is a technology necessary for generating dissident and coalitional cosmopolitics and for revealing the rhetorical structures by which the languages of aesthetics supremacy are uttered, rationalized, and ruptured. Black women, feminists, and women identified artists of color have taken up this strategy just as literary and theater practitioners have in the past in order to move spectators politically, to reveal structures of power and technologies of vision, and to, in other cases, complicate, disrupt, deceive, mislead, or redirect viewers through their visual constructions. So in the 1980s, O'Grady understood the art world ecosystems as unsustainable systems of racist exclusion and applied radical imagination, and in my book I argue radical presence, towards new ways of being Black and understanding Blackness in fine art contexts, and to challenge what it means to produce work of conceptual quality and how value is determined in context engineered to exclude Black creatives. O'Grady calls for greater access, visibility, and engagement for Black artists by deploying strategic acts of alienation and hypervisibility, which ultimately makes demands on her spectators. Through her practice, but especially in performances as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, O'Grady's deployment of direct address speech specifically highlights the opportunities and limitations of critical spectatorship, which necessarily includes both the position of her audience members, those who bore witness to these acts, and also the self-reflexive observation of the artist herself. And here I'm thinking, of course, of bell Hooks's oppositional gazing and the productivity in that stance and in that position for artists. During each iteration of Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, O'Grady's strange and disruptive performance produced a rupture in the logics of the New York art gallery scene as her adorned Black body and her poetic rebuke forces attendees to deal with the spectacle of both. Business as usual could not continue, so spectators necessarily had to recalibrate their expectations of the occasion as they were forced to shift from passive opening attendees to active performance participants. In the last 20 years or so, this strategy and the artist performance more broadly has really become so much a staple in discourses of contemporary art that its history and conceptual framework have achieved kind of an aura of verisimilitude. And this is something, a reading that I'm building on from Amelia Jones. Yet here, when studying the work of O'Grady, I found it necessary to reconceptualize this seemingly universally available strategy of direct address and the history and articulation of the artist's performance, specifically when analyzing her solo performances as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, whose creative existence is reliant on the very problem of silence, erasure, and censorship that motivates and informs these physical enactments more broadly. My work, along with O'Grady's, rebukes the power structures undergirding the systemic exclusion of Black artists across art and performance discourse. My work is also haunted as much as guided by Tavia Nyong'o's incisive query, and I'll quote, "If Black people have historically been reduced to their bodies, bought, sold, displayed, purchased, and used as chattel, what does it mean for an art form to take that former commodity as medium? Is it an act of reclaiming, healing, theft? And inspired by O'Grady's demand, I ask, what are the risks? Are there risks? And quickly for the art historians or the museum studies folks out there, I just want to note that I believe it becomes really necessary to trace these pioneering performances by O'Grady as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire in this period between 1980 to 1983, and meticulously attend to the work's density, specifically because the artist's direct address deployment of an alien body and alienation functions to theorize much longer, more robust histories of out-of-turn enactments within modern and contemporary art. O'Grady channels her own evolving approach to alienation and multifaceted identity politics into a dynamic series of multimodal performances, and in so doing, produced alternative ways of understanding direct address performances of this kind, and the myriad of social and political ideologies her work is both tapping into and working against. In the 1980s, O'Grady capitalizes on performance art's capacity for unruliness, articulating heterogeneous ideologies usually silenced and rendered invisible within the art museum. As scholar and artist Adrienne Piper also reflects in her writings, marginality may be, quote, more of a blessing than a curse, as alienation too has its uses, end quote. Thus, the historical silencing of Black women and women identified artists of color and the exclusion of their art from institutions itself presents a productive origin point for thinking about performance through O'Grady's practice. Alienation as an important intervention to mobilize alienation is an important intervention to mobilize for the very reason that to exist and to speak out of turn is to strategically use one's voice and presence in ways that rupture expectations, of the status quo. An alien body then, as deployed by O'Grady, disrupts the material semiotic coding of human and aesthetic reality, which is produced by historically specific objects, aesthetic tastes, conditions, and apparatuses of viewing human subjects. Props such as O'Grady's white glove, dress, sash, diadem, white gloves, and cat o' nine tails become the mechanisms through which the artist stages and subverts her own alienating presence as subject-object, and artist, performer, and work of art. Put another way, I'm arguing that O'Grady's alienating effects, or Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's alienating effects, produced through a melange of props and out-of-turn speech acts, and utilizing strategies of a direct address, make apparent how Black women's bodies, historically strange and overdetermined in Western art contexts, through avatar production, to cite Yuri McMillan, disrupt historic and systemic erasure across these spaces of visibility and value. So inspired and propelled by these historic enactments of liberation and self-determination, O'Grady's conceptual performances of radical, out-of-turn presence suggest that it is through alien bodies, effects, and mixed media acts that direct address art achieves a different kind of political agency for Black women who speak out of turn against the contemporary art museum specifically. So in Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, here in these images, O'Grady invokes the specter of the Black middle class to critique both the mainstream Western art milieus and the few Black artists who were managing to gain access to that mainstream at the time. In the 1980s, the significance of the white debutante gown and gloves would not have been lost on O'Grady's audiences. These coverings, the gown and gloves, work alongside the artist's rebellious tone and dialogue to argue that while fine art museums and galleries may have begun the token selection and exhibition of a few non-white artists, the art of Black artists remains too safe and largely directed at white audiences. In order to speak out of turn, O'Grady donned a white dress and wielded an ancient whip. She made strange the sight of the gallery, her own body as an artist, and the practice of viewing art, specifically performance art. This estrangement, quote, sutures together hybrid and sometimes profane cultural materials to rewrite categories of self-representation, end quote. And that's from Daphne Brooks. Furthermore, O'Grady experimented with ways to express the dissonant historical relationship between bodies of color and the dominant culture that sought to relegate them to the margins and or put them on display, and O'Grady plotted ways to draw attention to and subvert that dissonance. And I just want to note here that in the book, I do speak at some length about the complexities of reenactment, of pleasure, and also experimental play in these performances, all of which is present in the actual performance archive, but not so much discussed here, or really in exhibition context of this work. So, and to allude to this, I want to share two images here on the screen of the artist and just above Midtown gallerist Linda Good Bryant during one such reenactment, and the other on the right with Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire relaxed and laughing with her friends, and how the Black performers in particular are unable to walk away from their bodies, how their bodies are already conceived of in excess, right? And in the book, I lean really heavily on the work of Nicole Fleetwood as who has termed these particular too many performances by Black women as enactments of excess flesh, where artists and cultural producers take up the problem of Blackness in the visual field and draw attention to their own exclusion and erasures. So within Black female artistic traditions, deploying hypervisibility as co-constitutive of Black femaleness has become a strategic enactment of certain Black women identified cultural producers, including O'Grady. So this is where excess flesh enactments then work through spectacular performances and the presentation of one's self-image within the visual field. And Fleetwood's idea of excess flesh attends to the ways in which Black female corporeality is rendered as surplus or over the top and too much to handle, which I think is useful for understanding the implications of O'Grady's multimodal performances as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, because as a Black woman walking in the gallery, she's already overdetermined. The fact that she dons this bizarre regal attire and then performs in this way adds another layer of excess. And then the fact that the performance archive reveals a level of pleasure, right? Joy, play, in ways that we don't often see discussed, right, in the exhibition of these works. I think is all stuff that I unpack and I really discuss at some length in the book, but I wanted to highlight it here because I think Fleetwood's work, her early work, is just so invaluable for that reason, how we come to understand Black women's existence in the visual field. And so I just wanted to make that note. And also this disjunctive tension between the temporal experiences of alienation, amusement, or delight during the actual performance, and the way that the performance is later rendered for publication and ultimately the archive, is something that I also just want to bracket. So alienation then, unlike any other possible experiences of the work, such as amusement, delight, shock, horror, all of which is evident in the images from the work's documentation. What I'm trying to say is it really kind of, the work has been overdetermined in how it's presented as only creating perhaps anger or discomfort or agitation or inconvenience. And here I wanted to note that there's so much more, right, in this performance, and there's so much more that Lorraine O'Grady offers us through Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, and it's especially a window onto Black joy, Black pleasure, and how occupying these spaces is a part of all of that. So just wanted to flag that before moving on. So, okay, as a transition to discuss another aspect of O'Grady's performance persona, I want to again reiterate that what an artist fundamentally does, or how I'm understanding the work of artists in this moment and the work of O'Grady in 1980s, and that is an artist creates new worlds for us to inhabit, new possibilities. And that is what I find so powerful about the Black and White show, which I'm about to describe now, excuse me. So 3 years after Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's first invasive gallery performance, O'Grady shifts her focus away from out-of-turn enactments and towards the realm, another image that's really bad that I took on my phone of Black joy and, you know, this other reading of a performance against the grain of, you know, institutional critique as inherently like irritating, or this anger evoking experience. So onto the Black and White show. So she shifts her focus away from these out-of-turn enactments and towards the realm of critical space making. In 1983, her persona was the same, but on April 22nd, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire opened her first conceptual exhibition at the Black-owned Kankakee House Gallery on East 2nd Street in New York. She was relying on the work of 28 other artists, and she curated, so Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire curated the space to include exactly 14 Black and 14 white artists. The show was titled The Black and White Show, and rather than expressing her ideas and critiques through the boisterous and destructive speech acts, as she had previously done, she was trying to appeal to New York art audiences' sense of reason. The message was clear. Black artists were as talented as their white counterparts, and their work was exceedingly high in quality and should be shown in dynamic and integrated contexts, a sharp critique of the schematic logics of the Afro-American abstraction show years earlier. O'Grady's multimodal approach had shifted away from performance in this instance. Nevertheless, the artist still saw curatorial work as encompassing a set of invasive tactics. In the Black and White show, O'Grady mobilized aggressive new strategies to address critiques many artists were making in the 1980s regarding the systemic segregation of the art world. The ambitious debutante went to work again, this time soliciting artists to fill the large gallery space, which had been previously a grand Polish wedding palace. And as the curator of this conceptual collaboration, O'Grady's fierce persona set particular restrictions on the works that artists could contribute. Not only were the artists racially both Black and white, the works were limited in palette to just Black and white as well. Achromaticity, according to O'Grady, would heighten similarities and flatten differences. It would also be the first exhibit the artist had seen, quote, in the still virtually segregated art world with enough Black presence to create a dialogue, end quote. It was important for O'Grady that the race of the artist was not apparent on the labels, though she did wonder if it would show up in any way on the walls. The impressive range of painting, sculpture, installation, text murals, and conceptual work all fell within Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's strict stipulations, which meant that several artists offered atypical pieces for the show. This included conceptual artist Adrian Piper, whose original text-based submission, a flyer designed for a series of performances titled Funk Lessons, was conceived in Black and gold, but changed to Black and white for the exhibition. So of course, elsewhere I go into much greater depth to discuss the critical reception of this project, or actually lack thereof, and how the artist began to interpret this moment in her performance career anew in the early 2000s. But for our context today, in conversations about performances that push us towards more just and inclusive social dynamics, conceptual artists like O'Grady become a kind of cultural leader in their offering up of new modes of critique that simultaneously demonstrate more expansive and integrated possibilities. In this way, O'Grady's practice begs the question of what ways of thinking and new processes that we might draw from these kinds of artistic practices, right? So this is a conceptual art practice turned curatorial process turned exhibition. And this can be asked across the board, these questions of how might these be used as models, especially of artists working in this moment. And I'll give just a quick example of how the black and white show specifically has shaped my own curatorial process before moving on to our final project that I'll highlight. So the black and white show, editing the book really coincided with my arrival at Holyoke College Art Museum. And right when I got there, I was tasked at reinstalling the permanent collection gallery for modern and contemporary art. And there was a special exhibition show in there in the space. And so I had to reimagine the permanent collection anew in this space. And part of this was about getting to know the collection, but also knowing that I had to cover a massive span of time in a very modest sized gallery, and also maintaining a desire and a commitment to present work of artists from diverse backgrounds, wanting to champion the work of women artists in particular, you know, being at a gender diverse women's college. And then on top of all of that, so this is all the wish list, you know, all the expectation I was building up for this space, all the works had to play nice together on the walls, you know, and so we're looking at really works from the late 19th century all the way to works that were made last year. And I mean, it was quite a tall order, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated by what I began to assume the collection lacked, frustrated by not being able to tell a satisfying story of modern contemporary art with the art in the space that I had. And so this is when, you know, I started to explore the black and white show as a model. And I set the time bracket, or I set the time frame, and I culled all the works by all artists from this time frame that were black and white only, into one checklist. And from there, I was able to, as O'Grady mentioned, it heightened similarities and flattened differences. And I was able to examine one slice of an encyclopedic collection for very specific attributes, for the story I could tell. And, you know, it became very interesting how I could have a work by an artist working in the late 19th century on the wall next to an artist whose work was made last year. And the conversation opened up in this way where I think O'Grady was really concerned about race, and that too was a concern of mine, creating a diverse representation, a multifaceted story. But the show that I end up curating, called Proposition, Form, Gesture, really celebrates a strength that we have in the collection, honoring and amplifying a smaller space, but then also created an awareness of work I never would have known that we would have had I not looked at it in this specific way. Most of the work that will be displayed is by women, and presenting across cultures and across time periods. So I think this is just one model, and you know, I don't have time to get into quite the nuances and who the artists are, but I wanted to highlight the ways that this model became a model to approach my own curatorial practice, and in a way towards this kind of, this idea that there would be enough presence of any one thing to have a conversation, right? And so I hope that what has come out of my process-based model is that a conversation has been initiated, one that's rich and diverse. And so we'll see. Hopefully that'll open soon post-COVID. But I did want to just highlight the ways that we can understand these practices in the moment as potentially pointing us to new ways of thinking about our own creative and intellectual processes. Okay, so I want to end this proposition, so I'm going to talk about two works, but I'm going to end with this proposition of a performance as performance art as manifesto for the future. And that is how I kind of want to intro art is. But first I want to mention a quote or something that I found really resonant from Amiri Baraka's, you know, just timeless and important blues people. And so many other artists and so many other literary scholars have made these observations about Western art's kind of unique view, unique role of art in society, one that we don't see in many indigenous cultures, many African cultures, many, South American pre-Columbian cultures, that was inconceivable to make distinctions between art objects, dancing, music, worship, and life. That creative expression, indeed, what we might come to know as creative genius in the West's kind of conception of it, issued from life itself and was beauty and was aesthetics. Like that was aesthetics, this idea of life. And there wasn't this kind of call out of the art object in the same way. And Amiri Baraka has this, this beautiful moment where he makes this distinction in Blues People. But I think this work in particular really, kind of boldly pronounces and boldly blurs the lines between art and life. So O'Grady developed the public performance art is in order to address an acquaintance's assertion that avant-garde art doesn't have anything to do with Black people. O'Grady's dynamic response positioned avant-garde artistic sensibilities actually, in fact, at the center of Blackness in New York, a parade celebrating Black people with thousands in attendance, and arguably in the nation's artistic core, Harlem, New York. The artist remembers a day, September 17th, 1983, as one of the hottest days of that summer. And it was the day when she, along with 15 hired dancers and actors holding small golden frames, joined a sea of floats and marching bands at the African American Day Parade, which was an annual tradition in Harlem, New York. O'Grady had built, with artist collaborators Richard Deguzzi and George Mingo, a massive 9 by 15 foot antique gold frame mounted on a gold skirted float, seen here in this photo. The group entered the parade in the heat of the day and completed a 5-hour trek up Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard to the end of the route, capturing spectators and surroundings within their frames. In her own writing, O'Grady reflected, "I've never had a more exhilarating and completely undigested experience in my life." She characterized the sporadic rhythm of the parade as long waiting periods followed by sprints to catch up, a durational performance temporally rendered in the crowded urban environment. O'Grady gave this mixed modality experience the title "Art Is," after the black bolded text painted on the side of the float. Art Is was the last in this series of performances orchestrated between 1981 and 83 by the artist's alter ego, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire. It was a continuation of O'Grady's probing critique of the boundaries of the avant-garde and the role of Black creatives in the art world. Like many artists of color, O'Grady had found limited opportunities to exhibit her work within traditional art museums, and thus she embraced the unique format of the African American Day Parade's use of public outdoor space. Within this public space, the lines, as I was starting to mention, between the hired performers and the spectators were blurred. And O'Grady's float obscured the delineations between art and life, Black life in particular. Integrating performers, artists, and spectators, the work achieved what performance art historian Lucy Lippard calls the fundamental notion of feminist art, which is exchange. Reminiscent of street theater of the late 1960s and 70s, this integration of exchange subverted the art world's narrow conception of the avant-garde, placing Black and brown bodies inside gold frames, thereby proposing them as art. Art Is simultaneously highlighted the rejected notion of Blackness as outside of or antithetical to avant-garde creative sensibilities, an observation made by one of the parade's participants, quote, "That's right. That's what art is. We're the art," end quote, becomes a pointed mission statement as co-produced Black existence within the frame becomes the material evidence of artistic genius. O'Grady's Art Is was a mixed media, mixed modality, multi-participant performance piece, and I argue a spatialized manifesto. Significantly, during Art Is, O'Grady, who understood her actions as those of performance alter ego, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, pinned her personal pair of white gloves to the chest of the white t-shirt she wore for the event, as you can see in this image here. She had been unwilling to pin them to the white glove gown the artist wore during her original gallery performances as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire in 1980, but she finally donned her own gloves as accessories 3 years later during this final effort as the brazen debutante. O'Grady's brand of performative alienation on display in both performances is exemplary of direct address as a modality for breaking into the field of vision and claiming a voice through invasion. Ultimately, Art is a treatise made flesh as the artist and her collaborators danced in the streets of Harlem, both a manifesto and radical invocation of Black genius amidst the repeated denials of a persistently racist art world, and in response to the overall disappointment she felt about the lack of attention or critical reception around Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire's actions over the years. Art along with its performers and participants, stages a counter-narrative to the art world's narrowly conceived, strictly policed definitions of the avant-garde, and revises notions of Blackness as always already outside of or antithesis to the avant-garde's radical existence and creative sensibilities. Art highlights this outside by placing Black and brown bodies inside the frame. Frames intentionally wrought in gold, symbolizing the accoutrements of art's historical legitimacy. These alien geniuses, like pre-established avant-garde artists, are said to exist on the fringes, tapping into a range of underexplored possibilities for radical substance, textuality, and existence. That is, for Black survival. So I'm going to conclude with one final note, one final word, and then open it up for questions. This is a work by British born visual artist, singer, and composer Anoni, formerly known as Antony of the band Antony and the Johnsons. And here we can see a stunning woman in her mid-80s appears against a Black screen. She smiles pleasantly and glances off camera. And in the video, electronic music begins to play and the woman's bare shoulders bob and her delicate body sways to the beat. As the introduction fades into lyrics, the woman parts her lips to sing, but it is not her voice that touches the listener's lips. Instead, it is that of Anoni. And while Anoni has her own unique history of speaking and existing out of turn, the woman who appears in this video and claims another voice as her own, you all should recognize as Lorraine, as O'Grady, who for the entirety of the 3-minute video lip syncs to Anoni's song Morrow from the singer-composer's biting and beautiful 2016 album Hopelessness. The sound is distorted and the lyrics are chillingly allegorize the planet Earth as the woman's cancer-riddled body. The woman is exploited through capitalism and abused by a culture desensitized to its own violence. The resounding refrain, quote, we are all Americans now, end quote, packs a powerful indictment of the US-led misuse and destruction of the planet's resources and subsequent denial of the environmental ramifications of this historic abuse. In a statement on the video, Anoni wrote, quote, capitalism cares only for wealth extraction from the earth and from its people. We are slaughtering the future. Only a wartime effort can save us now. Stand with the water protectors in North Dakota. There is only one prayer left, save the earth, end quote. The singer-composer references then efforts by indigenous American groups to thwart the development of an oil pipeline that would cut through the native lands and pollute local water sources, one of the most contentious environmental crises at the time of the song's release. In fact, the entire album addresses a myriad of disasters, each highlighting the human and environmental tolls that come with the current trajectory of rapidly westernizing civilization. The music videos that accompany these doomsday dirges utilize predominantly static shots of a single individual as they lip sync to the disconcerting lyrics. Another such arrangement is the haunting presence of supermodel and actress Naomi Campbell, who through streaming tears in her own video, mouths the words to Anoni's "Drone Bomb Me." In Morrow, O'Grady's cheery expression at the beginning quickly dissolves into disillusionment as viewers watch the anguish set in on the artist's face, while lip-syncing the words, suck the oil out of her face, burn her hair, boil her skin. And so this is just a preview, but in the introduction, I go into much more depth analyzing this music video. But what I think why it's so powerful and why it's so mesmerizing is because it's really O'Grady herself and what she's come to symbolize through her practice of claiming physical space by deploying her voice in radical and disruptive ways in the art world for over decades prior. And so to summarize her practice, I mean, for those of you who might be unfamiliar, she's remixed the words of various author texts that she's culled in the New York Times, or from the New York Times, in a body of work, poetic work called Cutting Out the New York Times. She invaded the galleries. She invaded galleries in New York as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire. She also infiltrated Harlem's African American Day Parade in Art Is. And now here she is, invited to mime the words of another artist, her body mobilized as a hyper-visible stand-in for the age and yet timelessness of the planet. Certainly the power in the artist's dynamic presence is what's captured here and embodies forth in this performance. And so I'll just say that, and by way of conclusion, direct address and speaking out of turn are tactics that have historically made visible these workings of power, both within the art world and beyond. The analytic hook for this talk, Speaking Out of Turn, both gestures towards the disruptive power and the potential for the artistic category of address and other radical speech acts, and takes seriously the question of why particular artists have not been given space to speak or exist in the art world in the first place. And to acknowledge, and acknowledging these historic power dynamics, Lorraine O'Grady, along with many of her contemporaries, takes up these strategies in order to tap into the participatory potential for artworks to enter into dynamic spectator relationships as extension of the artist's own material and ideological subjectivities. So these artistic voices carry, so to speak, despite the absence or presence of their physical body or voice. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie Sparling Williams. That was really wonderful and gives us so much to think about. Thank you so much. I would like to
for having me.
I would like to invite those of you in the audience to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A. We have a couple to start with, which I'll just jump right into. The first question that we have pertains to audience, and you mentioned at the end that O'Grady is really committed to creating this dynamic spectator-performer relationship. And I was wondering if you can tell us any more about how Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire was received. There's so much joy and sort of pleasure, clearly, in some of the archival photographs. But you also mentioned the abrasiveness of institutional critique, which is what we sort of associate with these kinds of incursions. And one of our questioners is wondering, you know, if the expressions of the onlookers that seem to be smiling or enjoying the piece in a lighthearted way, is that important or integral to the piece, or sort of how does that sort of draw out the significance of those performances?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And something I've been thinking about a lot is the reception, and how I actually entered into conversations on O'Grady's work was through this idea of the spectator. How are these works received when artists are said to speak out of turn? And I will say that the performance took many iterations, and I think each one had a different tone. I think overall, I will say that O'Grady has expressed disappointment in kind of the 3-year run of the performance, not in the performance itself, spaces, or even acknowledgement in these spaces. And I think in that iteration, you know, O'Grady was friends with most of the artists, or she knew most of the artists. There were a lot of artists that were part of the show that she was kind of making her critiques. And so I think in that iteration, the tone was a lot different than the second iteration where we see in these other photos where she is at the new museum. Sorry. And this is more invasive. So this was in protest of, the show was called Persona. And O'Grady kind of dubbed it as like the white persona show. And because there were no artists of color represented, no Black artists. But O'Grady was invited to do a program for school children dressed as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire. And so she was invited to do this talk for school children. And she said to the programs officers, well, wait till after the opening, you know, we'll see if you still want me to do this talk. And then she came to the opening dressed, you know, dressed in Mademoiselle Bourgeoise, dressed as her character, and, you know, recited a different new poem about uninvited from her in this space. I think that, I don't know if we're having issues with the screen. It keeps, I can stop sharing. Is that what we're suggesting?
I think maybe if we stop the video, that could help. But
okay,
yeah, we'll see if this works.
I'm not sure if, did that answer come across? Were we still able to, I think, okay.
Yeah, I think for the most part, yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, sort of all these dimensions and all these different modes of interaction that she seems to be staging. You know, really complex pieces that get at both her sort of insider and outsider status within the art world in this kind of nuanced sense. One of the questions that I had is about this notion that you mentioned at the end, performance art as a manifesto for the future. And you frequently refer to the archive and the documentation that we have of these performances. And clearly O'Grady's career is something very different now in 2020 as her retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum is about to open. And I wonder, to what extent is there a certain like futurity to her performances, as if, you know, before her time, but also sort of speaking to an audience much later who will see the art world and the kinds of racial divisions that, you know, much more starkly, and will receive her performance in a different way. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And actually O'Grady had some thoughts early on where she actually prophesized her audience. So she recognized in the 80s that her audience had not yet come, and that, you know, the moment for her art was not yet here, right? For it to be engaged fully and appreciated. And I've spoken about that elsewhere, but I think she very much sees this moment as a moment where her audience is arriving, right, and coming to know her work. But I also think her art is living. There was never a past other than the one that we see documented in the archive itself. But O'Grady herself, as we see over the years, has continuously rewritten and revised and reinterpreted each of her projects, and has taken us all along for the ride on her website, in art publications and interviews. You know, her work is, I keep using the word iterative in a sense that, you know, it's not just the performance enactments, but it's also O'Grady's interpretation of them in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and again today. And you'll see that in the retrospective, that we kind of arrive at this moment where this work means much differently than it did at the time of its production. And I think that there's something productive. And I think that's why I use the word manifesto, and I use the word, you know, I use these ideas of future, because this work is, it is living, and it's continuing to propel us towards new ways of kind of experimental creative work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot to think about just in itself. We have a question about the black and white show and about the one of the conceits of half black and half white artists that weren't going to, but not revealing the race of the artist on the wall label. And so one of the students is wondering whether that information is still unavailable, sort of how that was disguised from the viewers. And then I would add on to that, of course, many of the artists are really well known, of course, Keith Haring or Basquiat. And so how was that sort of conceptualized?
Yeah, so I think because it was a conceptual art project, one might have assumed that she would have drawn attention to the racial differences between the artists. But, typically when you walk into an art museum, you don't see race on the label. Often we'll see culture, but you don't see race in the same way. So in that sense, she wasn't doing anything revolutionary in terms of the labels. They were kind of standard labels. I think the idea, so to answer the student's question more directly, yes, you can find out what the race is of these artists. And like you said, many of them are very well known. So, we know which artists are white and which artists are black. And if you don't, there's a list, a checklist of artists, and the flyer has most of the artists on them, and you can do a little bit of digging. But I think the whole point of that show was, and the whole idea behind it was, she really was interested in creating a dialogue between work, which is which most museum exhibitions seek to do, right? But the critical piece of that dialogue was that Black creativity, Black voices, Black art was being left out of the conversation. And so she staged an exemplar, right? A model for all of these other art institutions. Like, this is what it looks like to have equity on the walls. You don't need to know who's Black and who's white, but this is what it looks like, and look how amazing it is. And the show, was reviewed by literally almost no one. At the time when, people were kind of fetishizing these like avant-garde kind of grunge spaces in this moment. This and just above Midtown Gallery, they were just completely ignored, and it was very blatant, and even some of the artists' work would get taken up, like Toxic Junkie outside was taken up and used, but not attributed, right? Not attributed to O'Grady, not attributed to the gallery. And so this is where we see the racism, right? The blatant racism of the art world, because the show was, deemed as fabulous by those who did. And some even said that it was better than the Whitney Biennial of the same, at the same time. And so that, it's just, I think that is where we're at in terms of the idea that this could be a conversation, and this should be the conversation.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and especially to think of the afterlife of that show being, for instance, a curatorial model that you can apply right now at Holyoke. So I think that's really wonderful. We have a final question from a student, Jairo Cabrera, who is wondering about your thoughts on sort of whether you believe the way mainstream media consumes and interprets artworks today produced by minorities in the Western world has changed, and if so, in what way? So to kind of take a sense of the sort of distinctions from the 1980s until today, as far as perhaps a kind of radical performance, how would that be consumed and received?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think it speaks to this moment right now, probably on Zoom. Or probably on the streets. But no, I think it is so different, because I think the ways we access visual material is different, right? The ways all of the social and all of the connected media bring us our visual content today, I think really structures the way artists are imagining themselves in the visual field as a very virtual visual field. I think that we see artists like Sandra Perry, amazing work out just recently by Legacy Russell, explores glitch feminism, and glitch as being exploring kind of ontological ontologies of Blackness on the internet, and I think that Yeah, just to be very brief, I think we're seeing the platforms change. So where this kind of invasive performance in the gallery opening was where everybody was at. You know, this is where this work had its impact. And now I think the shift is in the site.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
artists are very much still working in performative modes.
Right. And I can see the kind of the flattening effect as well with social media and with the various sites through which we consume right now. So unfortunately, we do have some other really good questions, and I'm going to email those to you, but we do have to conclude. And I would just like to thank you again for a really wonderful talk, and thank you to our audience for being with us.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Have a good one.